Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Korb, let me start with you. Is there an Inspector General at the Department of Defense, and is that a person that we would rightfully expect to be doing the kind of work that the volunteers with the Defense Business Board have been doing?
Well, they would do some of it, but when you bring in groups like the Defense Business Board, they're people who understand how big organizations run. I mean, the Inspector General a lot of times deals with waste, fraud, and abuse, or people not behaving themselves. You could ask them, but I do think, and these gentlemen and men and women serve on there, non-paid, and they bring, my experience has been, they bring great expertise to help us, because a lot of times you need somebody from the outside to
take a look from the outside. Mr. Tillotson, let me ask you, did we waste $8 or $9 million of the taxpayers' money on a report on identifying waste in the Pentagon? And if we didn't waste it, what have been the savings that have come out of this report?
I don't believe we wasted the money. I think the work that was done, that was actually contracted, has been high payoff, and we continue to build on it. Direct answer to your question is, to date, we have loaded in approximately $7.9 billion worth of savings over the next 5 years based on the results of that study alone, and eliminating any other savings that we've been doing in prior years.
Okay, so it's a good start. You're saying around $7 or $8 billion.
And I will continue to reiterate my position that this is not a one-and-done activity. As far as I'm concerned,
forgive me for interrupting. We just have limited time. My concern is I represent the 8th Congressional District in Maryland, which includes NIH, which is now slated for a $6 billion cut. These are the scientists who are trying to rescue the population from lung cancer and breast cancer and colon cancer and cystic fibrosis and asthma and these killer diseases, and just cavalierly we would slash $6 billion from the NIH when we have a report 2 or 3 years old now saying that we can save $125 billion just by reducing bureaucratic bloat and contractor fraud and waste and abuse and overruns. And I looked into the history of this last night. This goes back to the 1960s, the cost overruns, and the 1980s with the $2,500 coffee makers and the $600 toilet seats, scandal after scandal after scandal. And I want to ask someone, maybe Mr. Korb, but let me come back to you. You've got a long history in the military. When you have that kind of systemic repeat dysfunction over the decades, you've got to believe it's not totally pathological. It's working for somebody. Who is this system of bloat, waste, fraud, and corruption working for?
Well, unfortunately, it works for the individual groups. The real problem you have, obviously—
When you say groups, you mean which groups?
Well, you have organizations, and in the Department of Defense, in the history, the services have not wanted to give up functions to the Office of the Secretary of Defense to the extent that they should. You have, basically, you have people, as I pointed out in my testimony, you've got a Defense Logistics Agency, but the services won't give up a lot of their logistic functions. I used to argue with them all of the time to let us manage that. I think you have, and I mentioned this too, creating all these under and assistant secretaries. My goodness, I mean, why do you need that many people up there in the Office of the Secretary of Defense? And we keep creating them. And as I've looked at that, the real key to running it correctly and making the savings is when you have a strong Deputy Secretary of Defense. As I mentioned earlier, David Packard came in from Hewlett-Packard, and you go back and you look at the fact we didn't have the cost overruns. The budget was half of what it is now. And I'll tell you who else was very effective. When Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense and he brought in Don Atwood from General Motors, it was an awful lot. It was very well done. But when you don't have that strong deputy in there, it becomes very, very difficult.
Okay, you need the internal push. Mr. Klepper, you talked about changing the culture at the Department of Defense to do it. What are the concrete steps that can be taken legislatively by Congress to help shock the system and change the culture so the taxpayers are getting their money's worth and we're not wasting our money in this way?
As a guy that's had a life as a change agent, that may be the biggest question I've heard today. Because when you look at large cultures that have, and often an organization as big as DoD, it's not one culture. It's a whole bunch of tribes out there that have their own cultures because of the size of it. There are three key things that I will always say to focus on, is that if you want to change the behaviors, it starts with leadership, and it's what gets recognized, reinforced, and rewarded. And to the extent as we worked our study across the institution, there is almost no trace. There are no metrics of productivity or reliability. There are mastery skills and appropriations. So I would say that the key would start with the head, and it would be that there's accountability for real measures of productivity. And as a leader in an organization, the most important people that you can influence are your direct reports. Because as you look through the chain of command, and it's a long one in an organization the size and complexity of defense, anywhere in that chain of command you fail to get the support, the recognizing, reinforcing, rewarding of these kind of values, it creates a black hole in the organization, and black holes are where change goes to die. So I would put enormous emphasis at that part. The mechanics, the operation, the skill sets, we can get that. There's lots of talented people that we can bring in to do that. But if it's not driven from the top, reinforced, recognized, rewarded, its odds of sustaining fall really, really dramatically. And that's certainly true in the commercial world, and I think that's human nature.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Blum from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel for being here today. I'd like to read something to you. In fact, I'll read it twice. Department of Defense remains the only federal agency that can't get a clean audit opinion of its statement of budgetary resources. Once again, the Department of Defense remains the only federal agency that can't get a clean audit opinion of its statement of budgetary resources. I'm from the private sector. I'm a businessman. I was CEO of a public company. I understand audits. I understand clean audits. Taxpayers have invested $6 billion of their money over the last decade trying to fix the audit problem at the Department of Defense. We did a little research, and I found out that the Department of Defense has the world's largest accounting and finance organization of any company, any organization in the free world. The largest. Doesn't seem to me to be a lack of resources. Will somebody, anybody, maybe we'll go one by one, please tell me, please tell the taxpayers, please tell my constituents in the state of Iowa why we can't have a Department of Defense that has a clean audit. Mr. Tillotson, I'll start with you. And I am very interested in these answers.
No problem, Mr. Congressman. And the direct answer to your question is I find the situation to be unacceptable as well. Have been working very steadily since I was moved up to OSD to try and put a lot more stick and rudder into getting the audit position cleaned up. I agree with you. It's an unacceptable position.
Who do you report to?
I report to the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Do they agree it's unacceptable?
Yes.
To your knowledge? Who do they report to?
Secretary of Defense. And
do they agree it's unacceptable?
Current Secretary agrees it's unacceptable. Yeah. And so the answer to your question is the very size of that organization. This will go to the point that I'm sure Mr. Klepper will build on. When we look at the business practices of the department within financial management, when we did that research with the McKinsey folks, it is the very size and kind of age of that process and the skill set of the people who are doing it that actually stand in our way, coupled with, candidly, our failure, and I'm going to say it this way, to enforce sound business practices in the non-financial community. We have very good rules, and sometimes we don't follow them. So I'm not going to sit here and make an excuse for you. The answer is we are working to fix that, and I agree with
Thank you for not making an excuse. I appreciate your candor.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rufford.
Thank you, sir. We're not an accounting firm, and our focus of our effort was really on the cost savings potential. But that said, when we came in, one of the big deliverables that we did, any cost savings effort, is having an authoritative data set, to having real numbers that everyone can agree to that this is the baseline. We spent an inordinate amount of time making sure we develop that so we can leverage it on a go-forward.
Does the Department of Defense pay their bills with checks? Or do they pay their bills with cash? They use checks, I assume, right? How can we not? How can we not know where the money goes? How does that happen?
We had to pull from 20 different data sets one view on this, and on that view, it had over 5 million lines.
Does this go back to the tribes we were talking about 5 minutes ago?
And also to this,
within the
where the
department?
IT and where the data sits. So part of what Mr. Klepper was talking about as well is just, how do you actually have a view of what the true spend is, and how do you actually take metrics as a go-forward basis to measure that over time to see if you're making productivity?
If we started cutting people's pay at the top, not the enlisted man, would this problem get solved? Maybe that's what we need to do. Mr. Bear.
Mr. Blum, I've had a substantial career in being on boards of directors of publicly and privately traded companies. So my diagnosis of the situation is that it's appalling, and it's all a direct result of leadership. I would encourage you to take a look at the transition report that we offered the incoming administrations. We offered it to the team of Hillary Clinton. We offered it to the team of Donald Trump. We said that the challenge in the department is getting a hold of its fiscal destiny, and the way you do that is put people who have business training expertise in these jobs.
How many years have you been saying this?
A long time.
Is anybody listening? Is Congress listening?
Well, I'm trying to find some light in the darkness. This current secretary, Jim Mattis, was at the time when I chaired the business board the last time, was the chairman of Joint Forces Command. The business board felt very strongly that the department had an excess of command infrastructure, one of which was Joint Forces Command. And we recommended to the Secretary of Defense at that time, Bob Gates, that he shut down Joint Forces Command. The commander was General Jim Mattis. He embraced it and thought it was a spectacular idea and led the reformation. What I find now is that he's picked an individual, if press is accurate, that he's picked an individual to be the deputy who's had a lifetime of being a chief operating officer and, frankly, a very tough customer about wringing out costs and achieving accountability in a very large defense aerospace company. I haven't met this guy, wouldn't know him if he came in the room. But what I've read about him on the internet leads me to believe that perhaps General Mattis is in fact embodying the recommendations that we made, picking really tough people to run these positions. The deputy is critical in that, who's Mr. Tillotson's boss. So I think it's all about leadership, it's all about toughness, and it's all about making it important. If it's not important, it's not going to get done, and you know that.
I'm happy to hear that. Maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, the chairman, can I have would you indulge us to have the rest of them answer, or very briefly?
The witnesses may answer.
And just try to keep it brief.
Yeah, I'll go quickly and answer your specific question. It's responsibility, and it's be determined to get this done. If it's determined to get it done, it'll get done.
I would repeat the leadership emphasis. I'd also say that one of the things that we see that is a confounding issue is a culture where almost anyone can say no, and very few people can say yes to the changes that you need to connect a lot of those dots. So that's part of it, but that still goes back to leadership.
Culture. Mr. Korb.
I think it requires a strong deputy. The secretary, he or she, is very busy running around the world and doing things, but you need someone like a David Packard or Charles Duncan, who came in from Coca-Cola, Don Atwood, who came in from General Motors. When I've looked at this, that's when the department has been run well, because they're the chief management, and they also have the gravitas to make the things happen that you suggest.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
My thanks to the chair. We've looked at the Trump budget, which purports to achieve huge savings through that it says can be done by looking at inefficiency and waste. Now, the largest budget in the domestic budget is, of course, the defense budget. So let's begin, as I think anybody would, by looking at the largest first. Well, I might ask this to any of you, to all of you. Let me begin with Mr. Korb. If you are making a serious effort to target inefficiency and waste in the federal government, could you possibly exclude the Defense Department budget?
Absolutely not, and I made that point. If you give them money, they'll have no incentive, if you give them more money, to make the reductions that they should.
Do any of you believe that you would exclude the Defense Department, set it aside, if you were looking at your entire domestic budget and not look at the Defense Department budget at all? Do any of you believe that that's how you would proceed? Hearing none, as they say. Well, if we look at the budget of the administration, far from looking for inefficiency and waste there, what we see is an unheard of increase, a $50 billion increase in that budget, taken, of course, out of the flesh of the rest of the domestic budget. So let's look at the State Department budget for starters. You look at the State Department and the Agency for International Development. It's a 28% cut. That some might say you cut that much, you starve the agency to death. Mr. Korb, do you believe there would be any agency left standing if you took 20% out of a combination of USAID and the State Department?
I think if you do that, you will jeopardize national security. And as been already pointed out by your colleagues, most military people have objected to that, including the current Secretary of Defense.
You think you'd get a more efficient State Department, for example, at USAID, by cutting them 28%?
I don't think so. For example, you have more people in military bands than you do in the Foreign Service. So the idea that somehow or another you can cut back just really doesn't make a great deal of sense.
So I ask you to look at this combination, because I was interested in how all this adds up. You take the USAID and the State Department, that's a 28% cut. Then you look at the rest of the domestic budget. Look at the EPA, that's a 31% cut. Or the Labor Department, that's a 21% cut. Now, isn't it perhaps it's a coincidence, but you get a total there of $58 billion, which is about the same as the increase proposed in the Defense Department budget. So let's assume you could get such a huge amount pouring into one budget so quickly. Is that the way to get to, could you get that amount used efficiently so as to justify lobbing in such a huge amount at one time on one agency? Mr. Korb.
I don't think so, particularly as I mentioned earlier, the new administration is adding $30 billion to the 17 budget. So they're going to put that in, in the fiscal year. It ends, 1 October, so we're already a good way through it. And they add another 54. I think we'll, find it very tough to do it in an efficient way. And that's why I commend the business board here, because they talked about the savings over 5 years, not having them all right in the first year.
Mr. Tillotson, this is an increase over 1 year. Can you cite me any precedent where such a huge amount got spent efficiently over a single year?
So I can't cite a precedent, but I can cite the concern of the Secretary of Defense that we not ask for something that is not executable. And I can also cite the fact that the Secretary of Defense is internally on record with the tasking to the Department through the DepSecDef to look for additional efficiencies. And I can also state that the White House and the Office of Management and Budget is still holding the Defense Department accountable for offsetting part of the proposed increase in spend by continuing to find efficiencies within the department. I don't think anybody is letting the department off the hook in this conversation, and I will defer the rest of the prioritization of the budget to the White House. That is their decision, and I'm not privy to that conversation.
Of course, and the way to do credible savings is to do across-the-board savings, and then maybe somebody will believe your budget. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now, I'll recognize myself for questions. Mr. Tillotson, the Washington Post article, investigative report actually, said that the Pentagon knew their back office bureaucracy was overstaffed and overfunded. If you knew that, why didn't you do anything about it?
So respectfully, we have been doing something about it. Since Secretary Gates, we've been continuing to draw down the headquarters staffs of the Department of Defense. That was an initiative from Secretary Gates years ahead even of the DBB study. We continue on that trend, and we're meeting those goals.
So,
we've reviewed the defense agencies.
So
I would take a bit of issue that the so-called back shop that we talk about in some cases, because we talk about the defense-wide account, includes the Defense Logistics Agency, which does central purchasing and procurement.
Sir, I want to continue on with some other stuff.
Yes, sir.
And I appreciate the detail, but we've only got a few minutes, or we can take as long as we need to, I guess. But you said you did something about it. I would assume that the fact that Chairman Bayer, Mr. Stein, Mr. Klepper, Mr. Rutherford are here is that was part of the actionable effort, this study. Would that be correct, Mr. Rutherford?
So our study finished almost 2 years ago, and in that study we laid out a path with the DCMO on how to measure this on a go-forward basis with line of sight into where to do the savings.
And how much of that's been implemented?
I would have to ask Mr. Tillotson. Our
Mr.
contract.
Tillotson, how much of that's been implemented? Can you give me a percentage amount?
Yes, sir. I will go back and say $7.9 billion worth of efficiencies have been laid in, which includes
Less than 8%?
less than 8%. But as acknowledged in the DBB study itself, we needed to start, we needed to put some pieces in place, and then we needed to continue and sustain the effort, and that's our intent.
How much of your recommendations, Mr. Rutherford, do you think could be implemented?
We think all the recommendations that we
That's a
laid
great
out.
answer. Thank you very much. Do you think that they could have quickly implemented 20%?
The speed is the biggest issue. So what we laid out with the DCMO is that the speed in which you would do this would actually have to be quite deliberate of year-over-year productivity, which is around, from our estimations, a 3% productivity gain every year, which would only be about $4 to $5 billion every year. To get something so quickly up front would take something much more robust than we laid out.
I want to ask you something else about, and sticking with you, Mr. Rutherford, and the investigative article also made this. The average administrative job at the Pentagon was costing taxpayers more than $200,000, including salary and benefits. Was that salary and benefits, or are there other costs in there? I find that shocking that was the average cost.
Yeah, my understanding it was salary and benefits, but I should go back and get that for you.
Would you, I would like for you to provide some answers, some questions to the committee, because I'm not sure you'll be able to answer them right now, but I'd like to know how many people overall were in those administrative positions, how many were civilian versus military, and if you know the answer, I'd love to hear it, and I'd like to know how many of those earned over $200,000. Because if the average is $200,000, including salary and benefits, frankly, that's shocking to me. And how many are over $250,000? And we're seeing this throughout the federal government. This is something I'd like to know. Could you provide those answers? How many total are working administrative jobs? How many are civilian versus military? How many of those earn over $200,000? And how many of those earn over $250,000?
Since our work ended 2 years ago, I can go back and look at those numbers, pull together what our view was at that time.
Mr. Tillotson, I request the same information from you. You should be able to provide up to date.
I was going to say, I think respectfully, Mr. Chairman, I'm the accountable agent for answering your question, and I understand the question. We'll be happy to take it on.
Do you think we could get that next week?
I see no reason why not.
Thank you. That's. I've only got a few seconds here, and here's the thing that bothers me about this, and you realize that the appearance, even the appearance of a cover-up of a report like this undermines the Pentagon's credibility. It undermines your credibility, frankly. You hurt personnel that work at the Pentagon who show up for work every day and do their job. You hurt the taxpayers and you added their burdens. You hurt the finances of the United States government. You know, every dollar that's wasted is another dollar because we're doing deficit spending that we're having to pay interest on. You know, the total amount of waste is more than $125 billion when you take that into account. Finally, by wasting the resources committed to our national defense, I think you compromise the military's ability to carry out its mission. And that's what is so troubling here is you look at the total financial picture of the United States government and the path that we're on. I mean, we're at $20 trillion in debt. If we're having to pay interest on that entire debt, a 1% increase in interest on that, Mr. Stein, is $200 billion. Okay? So you begin to understand why everybody on this committee is so sensitive to this, because you're adding to the burden of the American taxpayer. And I think it was the Joint Chief of Staff Chairman, Admiral Mullins, that said that the single greatest threat to our national security is our debt. So I appreciate the seriousness with which this hearing has been accorded by each one of you, and I appreciate it very much. But we've got to get a handle on this, not just at the Pentagon, but throughout the federal government, but particularly at the Pentagon. Because constitutionally, that's our first obligation, is our national security. With that, I'll yield back and recognize. Sorry, the chair recognizes Mr. Desaigner from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for this hearing. I'm reminded of many conversations I used to have with my father-in-law, who was a highly decorated Air Force general, World War II, who ended his career, near the end of his career, he was the Auditor General of the Air Force, Major General. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross, but he also won something, his memory serves me, called the Zuckert Award, which was, at the time, was the highest achievement for management. He used to say that was harder to get than the Distinguished Flying Cross, flying over Germany. But he also told me that too many people in the Department of Defense were more interested in keeping their jobs than doing their jobs well. So, Mr. Korb, you mentioned the Packard Initiative. I often think back in reference to Peter Grace and the Grace Commission. Why were those effective in having business people being able to make observations? I mean, this is not new, having business people come in and look at the public sector, acknowledge that they're different, and be able to get both Congress and the bureaucracy to change their culture and implement those. The frustrating thing, as you've said, is it doesn't seem sustainable, although I do want to congratulate the Department of Defense in this instance of bringing Republicans and Democrats together in common cause. Mr. Korb?
I think it's because of the fact that they've managed large organizations and they understand how to make them work. Plus, they have the gravitas to be able to stand up to generals, admirals, and other people. And I think that's the key thing. When I worked in government, we had things got pretty bad, and was mentioned earlier about the toilet seats and all of that. We had to bring David Packard back to help straighten things out. And I think if you take, as I've looked at this all the time, when you have a deputy like that, and many times, the presidents will pick the deputy even before the secretary. Before Dick Cheney took the job, Brent Scowcroft had picked up Don Atwood from General Motors. So I think that's the key, because you have a lot of people, military people like your father-in-law, done all these distinguished things. So you're going to need a big presence to be able to tell them, what to do. And I think that's how it's worked best. I mean, after all, David Packard, everybody knew Hewlett-Packard and back in the 70s because of how important that company was. When he said stuff, he made it happen. Right. Just to give you an example, the services didn't want to have a single transportation command, okay? is able to get that done.
So here's a struggle, and Mr. Klepper, to you, and you've gone from different industries and been able to look at cultures, and as the McKinsey report says very clearly, that culture is a big thing, the willingness to accept criticism, to acknowledge that you need to accept that criticism in a manner that would be corrective, but seems to be uniquely difficult in this environment. So one quote from the McKinsey report, as acknowledged through the Washington Post investigation, said, McKinsey noted that while the Defense Department was, in quotes, the world's largest corporate enterprise, end quotes, it had never, in quotes, rigorously measured the cost-effectiveness, speed, and agility or quality of its business corporation. Seems rather striking that that hasn't happened. So both on that comment and then on a comment you made in the same article where you're quoted as saying, you're about to turn on the light in a very dark room, and I won't read the rest of the quote, quite colorful, but it strikes me that that's really the essence of it. And there have been different periods of time where your kind of effort has worked in the Department of Defense or in large public agencies, but this keeps coming up, that the culture is the most resistant to changing, and oftentimes, as my father-in-law said, the rewards and promotion within that culture is more about just getting by than actually performing well.
Well, having been in a number of organizations where the task was a major disruption, a major change from the status quo and some of the business direction. A couple of things. Look, this isn't studies. This is sort of what Kenny's learned, along the way. Is I talked about leadership as sort of the irreplaceable. Without that, you're sort of lost. But the other two things that I think are vitally important, and I do think they apply here, and we've heard different versions of it, is transparency and accountability. Whether it's the audit system that we talked about, it's because you can't have an accountable organization without a transparent organization. Understand, there's a lot of classified stuff, but the things that we're working on here, this is not classified stuff. And I do believe that, sunshine is a good disinfectant. One of the greatest things that we could do is to make the kind of inefficiency information more available to third parties and have ideas and have innovations to do that. But even then, if you don't deal with the tribal cultural who gets promoted and for what, that's the recognized, reinforced, and rewarded. You got to go really, really hard on that. And at some place, efficiency and productivity have to become a more dominant marquee in that story. And I think if you start there from the top, and if we can successfully begin to bring transparency, we'll attract good practices, and there's an unbelievable amount of talent. And the other thing where I think where the article misrepresented somewhat the Pentagon, almost all the senior military people that we talked to were extremely supportive. I outbriefed General Odierno, and he was going up to testify during sequestration. And there's a whole room full of people, and it was like you're going in the Coliseum, is Kenny and Bobby going to get their head chopped off, or this is not. And we outbriefed to General Odierno, and he looked at us and he said, I think you guys did a good job on the study, and I think the savings is there. And he paused and he said, your timing's not perfect. But he tasked people to move ahead, and then we weren't able to follow through. So the talent's there. Transparency and leadership, I think, are the starting place, and I think it is something that we can do. This is an achievable goal, and there's lots of reward for us if we do it.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I'll recognize myself now. Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, the easiest thing in the world to do is to spend other people's money, and secondly, you can never satisfy any government's department or agency. You can never satisfy any government agency's appetite for money or land. They always want more. And I have wondered for many years, where are there any fiscal conservatives at the Pentagon? I'll tell you a little story. I've been here a long time. This is my 29th year. When I first came here, I believed everything the Defense Department said, and I voted for the first Gulf War because I went to all the briefings and heard how great a threat Saddam Hussein was. And then I watched that war, and I saw his same so-called elite troops surrendering to CNN camera crews and empty tanks. So by the time the Second War rolled around, I had a lot more questions. And I got called to a meeting in a little room at the White House with Condoleezza Rice and George Tenet and John McLaughlin, the top 2 people at the CIA. And I asked him that day many questions, but I asked him, Lawrence Lindsay, the President's main economics advisor, had been on the front page of the Washington Post saying a war with Iraq would cost us $200 billion. I asked about that, and Condoleezza Rice said, oh, no, it wouldn't cost nearly that much. It'd be 50 or 60 billion, and we'd get some of that back from our allies. Now we're up in the trillions. That must have been the worst estimate in the history of the federal government. And I can tell you that when I was one of the 6 Republicans who voted against going to war in Iraq, it was the most unpopular vote that I ever cast in my district, because I'd seen a poll the night before saying 74% of the people in my district favored the war, 9% were against, and the rest undecided. But slowly over the years, that most unpopular vote ended up becoming the most popular vote that I ever cast. And now, as I sit here now, I hear all these people say that the Defense Department has been decimated or it's underfunded. And yet I look at the historical tables of the official budget, and it says that in 2002, the defense budget was $348 billion. By 2010, it had gone to $693 billion. And it's just gone up every year. And this past year, in the budget, we spent $177.5 billion on new equipment. Well, we spend that much, or close to it, I guess, just about every year. Well, that equipment doesn't wear out in 1 year time. And the military construction budget is a separate budget. You can't go to any military base in this U.S. or in the world there's not all kinds of new construction going on. We somehow have got to bring this under control. We've got to get some more fiscal conservatives at the Pentagon. And I believe, and I think most of us believe, that national defense is the most important function, or certainly one of the most important functions of our entire federal government. But it's getting kind of ridiculous when, the Pentagon has done a masterful public relations job in convincing people all over this country that they're underfunded or been decimated. And I think it's almost gotten to the point that it's in my opinion, it's pretty ridiculous. I am a very conservative Republican, but I think conservative Republicans should be the ones most horrified by the excessive overspending that's going on at the Pentagon. And I commend the work that your board has done. I mentioned this $125 billion in the last newsletter a couple months ago that I sent out to my constituents. We need more work that will go on like that. And now I yield to Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I associate myself with much of what you have just said. I don't think you need to be a conservative, but I do think your outlook needs to be fact-based, and I think that's where the differential comes in. I just have one bone to pick, not necessarily with you, and I want to thank all of the witnesses here. You've all been very, very helpful, and I appreciate your report. Haven't gone through all of it yet, but I will. The new President Trump came in, and one of the first things he did was to put a freeze on all federal hiring. And Mr. Tillotson, DoD is the biggest employer of returning veterans and veterans in this country. The federal government is collectively the largest employer of our veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and those who have served this country. The result of first of all, the economics. We've had 2 other hiring freezes, one under Reagan, one under Jimmy Carter, and both of them, according to the GAO, increased spending in the federal government because we went to contracting, private contracting, and it boosted up the cost. And I think that's going to continue here. I don't think we're going to save any money. The other thing is, because we are in the federal government, such a large employer of veterans, what this hiring, so 30% of our federal employees are veterans, about 30%. So what this does now is it puts a freeze in. So as these kids are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, federal government, which normally would hire them, is saying no. And so we've got an elevated, we're already dealing with an elevated suicide rate. We've got substance abuse problems. We've got big problems with transition coming back in because of the multiple deployments that these kids have done. And I was over in at Camp Leatherneck there in Afghanistan, and I asked some of those kids how many tours. I got all the way up to 7 tours. You know, one of those young men was there on his 7th tour. So that's got to cause some psychological problems. In the meantime, when they come home, we're telling them we can't hire them. So, and also it's costing us more money. So that's just a statement I got that is in opposition clearly to what the President's doing. Now, my background, here's where the question comes in. My background is in construction, steel erection. Used to build bridges. I was an iron worker for about 20 years. My degree is in construction management. So this stuff with DoD is infuriating to me. It really is. And from my own experience, transparency, Mr. Klepper, right on the money. That's what it's all about. In my business, my prior business, transparency and competitiveness in bidding, that whole process was really what gave the end user, the taxpayer, the biggest bang for their buck. And, you know, when there was no workaround, our contractors would come in and sharpen their pencils, and boy, that dollar would go a long way. And when there was a lot of work and people could just throw a number at you, things were much more expensive. This process that we have with DoD, and we've got 36 major defense laboratories all around this country, including my own, where I can't figure out how to get a person who wants to bid on some of that work into the process. It's all smoke and mirrors. You need a secret handshake or something. I can't get people on the job who want to offer a lower price for those services. And you know, it looks like to me, I have to say this, that a lot of retired generals have gone to work for these contractors and are in the system now. And it's like this good old boy network where the smaller companies can't get in there and offer lower prices. It's a real problem. And, you know, there are exceptions. I know Raytheon brings in all these subs and they try to help with competition, and they'll educate the smaller subs so they can use them. They use the sub to the sub to the sub. But is that at the heart of this problem? That's the question I have. Is that the heart of this problem? To make this, and I do agree with you, Mr. Klepper, some of this stuff is confidential, some of it's classified, but a lot of it is not. And we should throw it out there and make people bid openly, publicly, and competitively to make our government run more efficiently and at a lower cost to the taxpayer. Mr. Klepper.
Short answer is yes, I think that's a significant part. If you look at contracting, you know, I was just thinking as you were talking, you know, the way that you get in is you find the sub of a sub of a sub, and you get on somewhere, which means you got to know somebody that knows somebody generally to find them, and then there's a big, you know,
yeah.
By the time, you know, the government pays a tab, there's a lot of additional cost on it. The other thing, there's a practice here that's been around for a long time that drives all the worst possible behavior for spending, and it's a process that I don't know what the official, maybe David could help. It's use it or lose it. If you don't spend all your money, then you get your budget cut. And one of the things we saw in the study, at the end of the year, there's a tsunami of contracts that completely overwhelmed the contracting unit. There were anecdotal conversations with the McKinsey team where a single contract officer had to sign 60 contracts in one day. Because if they don't get them signed, whoever the authoring contract, it's going to be heck to pay.
Wow.
Because now you got my budget cut. So you have that practice, and that's a practice I just have to believe. I'm not smart enough to know how, you know, you guys could fix it. There has to be a way to fix that, because that's driving insane waste of money. So use it or lose it. And I think the contracting structures are where there's some quick hits. And I would just add lastly, the key to getting the numbers at the level that we're talking about is we need a large mobilization. To go at this study, it should take a mobilization of 400 or 500 people that we're putting in teams, we're training them, we're deploying them, and they got targets and goals. Until we scale up how we even think about attacking this problem, we'll continue to just get dribs and drabs of savings.
They tell me we've got to speed this up because we've got votes coming up, but I will tell you, I have a bill in that gives an incentive award that lets a department keep half the money that they save, and half goes back to the budget.
Mr. Chairman, if I could?
Yes.
I also have a bill that would allow veterans to be exempt from this hiring freeze, so at least when our kids come home from Iraq and Afghanistan, the government can hire them if they're qualified for those jobs, and the jobs are available.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Grothman.
I have a question for either Mr. Stein or Mr. Klepper. What steps have the DBB team taken to ensure that benchmarks are applicable to the department?
I really can't answer that. We intentionally, in our study, tried to avoid benchmarking because we were looking at such a high level. Done benchmarking, you end up spending all your time arguing about apples and oranges comparisons. So benchmarking, I think, has an appropriate. I don't know, David, if you can answer that, but I can't speak for the department there.
Mr. Congressman, one of the deliverables that we asked for from McKinsey was, in fact, benchmarking in some of these business areas compared to commercial sector, and it's what points us to some of the first areas to look at. So specifically, financial, IT, and human resource management were identified as areas where the department's spend on certain activities, which has a good commercial analog, which is the first question we asked, would suggest we could find additional savings. So we are in fact using it.
Okay. How would you characterize your overall level of confidence in the cost and savings presented in the report? And I guess that's really more for Mr. Stein. Okay. How would you characterize your overall level of confidence in the cost and savings presented in the report?
You know, until you have a full process of mobilization and a commitment to this process, you know, one of the things that was talked about, I think you got this study by McKinsey was done 2 years ago. I think you're going to have to update those numbers to see what actuals are. And I think you have a full commitment from the Secretary of Defense that this is what's going to happen.
Okay. There are a number of individuals interviewed as part of the report. Were those same individuals providing the preliminary findings from the report? And if so, what feedback did they provide on the data sources used as well as the magnitude of the savings identified?
Go ahead,
Nate. The primary feedback, and I could yield to Mr. Rutherford from McKinsey because I wasn't personally present during the actual data pool, but what we knew that when we build the base case, I've done this type of work and know that the data always gets attacked. For anybody, if it makes something looks bad, the first thing you do is say the data is not good, and that's often where you get stopped at. So we took extraordinary effort in the data pool to be sure that when the data was pulled from a system and it was arrayed against the core processes, that there was a local sign-off within the agency or the military department that said the way that the data was stacked was reasonable, because we also wanted to be able to rerun the models on an annual basis so you can track financial performance over time. So those are the two things that we put a lot of rigor in that. Now, when we got into the data pool, we found some of the same issues that may affect the audits as financial systems, et cetera. But I have to say, the McKinsey team, working with Dave Tillotson and the people he provided us, and there were over 100 people involved in this data pool. It was the biggest one, I believe, has ever happened at DoD, that the foundational data is pretty solid. And we also offered a challenge process that if somebody saw the data and said, hey, this is wildly wrong, your analysis is bad, that we could actually come in, audit the numbers, and if we found an error, look, if it was wrong, we want to know what the model's wrong, we could correct it. So the model came through, and to date, I don't think we have had any substantial challenges, at least that I've heard, that the base case model is wrong. The real debate, and maybe to your earlier question, there's two parts of it. Is the savings there, the potential? And I would say it is absolutely there, and it's probably conservative. The big question is, can all of us together move the barriers and get the implementation leadership? How much of it can we get and how fast? And I think that's sort of the wild card answer. And I believe we have a shot at the numbers that we published. I really do. But we certainly would need help from you and others like you to get some of the barriers out of the way.
Okay. I guess I have time for one more question. Mr. Tillotson, what level of independence was given to the McKinsey team?
The McKinsey team was basically on their own, other than the assistance it took to get them into the databases. Their analysis then was their own. And the DBB analysis, which was also done, was also independent. We did not influence either outcome.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for holding the hearing today. The topic of waste within the Defense Department is extremely important, and it deserves our attention, especially considering President Trump's budget proposes funding a $52 billion increase in the Defense Department by cutting other parts of the federal budget. While I definitely agree that we should support the nation's war fighters with everything they need, I am concerned that this budget proposal would hurt our national security in other ways. Dr. Korb, our national security depends on more than just a properly resourced Defense Department, does it not?
Yes, it certainly does. As we've talked about here, several other agencies that are being cut to pay for this are actually going to undermine national security.
Thank you. And we've talked about, I know, the State Department and the contributions it makes to our national security. I would like to ask about another cut. Under the President's proposal, federal funding for the National Institute of Health would fall by $5.8 billion, roughly a 20% cut. As chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, this is very concerning to me. The President's proposed cuts would halt cancer research and other invaluable medical research among the more than 2,600 institutions that receive NIH funding. The cuts would also affect research into infectious diseases, which respects no national boundaries. According to the New York Times, over the last 50 years, 700,000 Americans have died from AIDS, 1.2 million died from the flu, and 2,000 died from the West Nile virus, and 1 died from Ebola. During a television appearance on March 17th, Republican Congressman Tom Cole stated, "I don't favor cutting NIH or Centers for Disease Control. You're much more likely to die in a pandemic than a terrorist attack, and so that's part of the defense of the country as well." Congressman Cole called the President's proposed cuts very short-sighted. Do you agree that short-sighted cuts should be avoided?
I certainly do, and I'd like to quote my favorite president, Eisenhower, who said, "You can't be strong abroad if you're not strong at home. And if you don't deal with these diseases, you're going to have a difficult time getting enough people to volunteer for the military who meet all of the requirements that you need."
Thank you. Anybody else care to comment? No? Okay. Mr. Chairman, while I fully support providing necessary resources, again, to our nation's war fighters, we need to carefully consider whether we hurt our national security on other important fronts like global health. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel. I want to commend you. Incredible amount of work that you've all put into this. You've bled for it. I commend you for not just sitting there and engaging in a primal scream for the last 2 or 3 hours. A couple things, and I know my colleagues have been reading from some of these quotes, but we've talked about how the President's budget is going to impose draconian cuts on a lot of domestic programs, things that we've all acknowledged are important, as well as foreign aid and so forth. NIH, I know that my colleagues have spoken to those cuts. This quote from OMB Director Mick Mulvaney that was just priceless, where he, in regard to the NIH cuts, said, "These were made because of the tremendous opportunity for savings at NIH," and that, I'm sure someone else has read this quote, but I just want to repeat it. Quote, "The President's business person view of government is focusing on efficiencies and focusing on doing what we do better." I have to assume you all, when you saw that quote, just grabbed this report, we'll call it a report, and just ran as fast as you could up to the White House and handed it to President Trump, because it's all about a business person's view of government and focusing on efficiencies and on doing what we do better. Let's talk about the culture, because that's the name of the game here, breaking the culture. And I've heard you speak, Mr. Klepper and Mr. Korb, Mr. Stein, about leadership being important, transparency and accountability being important. How high do you have to go to get the person who can actually make the change in the culture? Is it enough to go to an assistant secretary of defense? Do you got to get at least to the Secretary of Defense to embrace the change in culture? Or do you actually have to get to the president who gets up every day who says the Pentagon has got a lot of waste and inefficiency in it, and one of the priorities today and tomorrow and the next day is going to be for us to attack that and make it work more effectively? How high do you have to go to find the person who you think can break the culture in a meaningful way? And you can just start with Mr. Korb there.
Well, I think it's really got to be your Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Secretary, whoever he and hopefully someday soon she is, basically has going to be traveling around the world and doing a lot of things. The Deputy is the one who has to do it, and as I mentioned here, people like David Packard, Charlie Duncan from Coca-Cola, Don Atwood from General Motors, they've been able to do these things. And I think that's really where it has.
So it can, in terms of deploying the culture change, you need that level. But you would certainly agree, I guess, that if you don't have the acquiescence in it or the buy-in or the approval of it from the levels above all the way up to the president, then that person can't be effective, presumably.
Well, that's true. It's
right?
certainly, if you take President Trump at his word, you would think this is what he wants to do. And if the secretary, whoever he or she may be, should certainly buy into that and then get a strong deputy to make sure that it happens.
Other thoughts?
You know, it's the sponsor model for change, and you know, it starts with the president. You know, he is mega sponsor ultimately, because even though the size of the Department of Defense from an efficiency standpoint has a bigger potential, it's an issue across all of government, and it's an issue in all of industry. So this is high-performance organizations needs to be reinforced all the way from the top. Now, that's delegated, and I would say we had a case in the Department of Defense where the Deputy Secretary was all in. It was a change of leadership at the top, and we kind of went dark. So in that situation, you know, it really starts within the Department of Defense with the Secretary of Defense, because if he's reinforcing and holding accountable to some tangible metric, organizational efficiency, the odds that those direct reports are going to hold their staff accountable. And that's that cascading chain to where at any point somebody decides they're not interested in this and they're going to get evaluated differently. That's the black hole where change goes to die. So that's a really essential key to success.
I'm going to run out of time, so I just want to emphasize what you said. Culture change can't happen if it doesn't start at the top, all the way at the top. And this is the federal government. The person who's all the way at the top is the President of the United States. So leadership matters from there, but transparency and accountability, if those are going to be standards that can accomplish the kind of change you want to see and that you work so hard to produce, to tee up for us, then that commitment to transparency and accountability has to begin at the very top. And this committee has had the opportunity just in the last few weeks to demonstrate that we're not seeing that kind of accountability and transparency coming from the very top of this organization, which is the federal government, and in this case, the executive branch of the federal government. I hope we see more of it so that we can get to the progress.
I'm sorry, we got to go to Mrs. Maloney.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of you for your service. It's really, personally, I think it's a scandal. It's an incredible scandal. Of the 34 areas the GAO highlighted this year, 7 for mismanagement or high risk, 7 were in the Defense Department. And basically what your report showed, that if you had implemented the findings of this report that you all worked so hard on, you would have resulted in $125 billion in savings, so that the losses that my colleagues are talking about for essential services for people wouldn't happen. I mean, I think that this is an absolute scandal. And it seems to me like if you can't, in reading some of the history of this, it's the Defense Department itself that stops the investigations, that stops the reforms, that says the data should be kept secret. It struck me, Mr. Rutherford, that you said you couldn't even get your hands on it, and especially what you said, you didn't know where it was. Do you have any sense of how much of the bureaucracy, of the many levels that they go through is in the budget? Is it half of it? Is it a quarter of it? Is it a tenth of it? How much of it is in this permanent bureaucracy that's been created of the Defense Department spending, would you say?
So what we looked at in our work was looking at the 6 core business functions. And within those business functions, we had to pull from 20 different data sets to pull all the information to actually give the transparency that Mr. Klepper is talking about, so then Mr. Tillotson can move out against that to see what they can make adjustments against. As far as the percent of that as bureaucracy, that's when we started to cut down where can they actually find the savings. And that's when we came away with our $62 to $84 billion number over a 5-year period, because it adjusted for a little bit more of a deeper dive into these sub-functions.
I mean, that is, a sense, amazing. Just to respond, you know, I think we should, if the culture can't seem to change, I think Congress should step in and help them change it, Mr. Chairman. Why don't we pass a bill that their data has to be transparent so that people can see it, so that people can report on it? If they're hiding their data, number one. Number two, on their contract system, that the sub of the sub of the sub of the sub gets to a small business, why don't we have a competitive bidding to the best qualified? Forget all, I've read that someplace you have like 155 contractors. For what? You write up the specs, you throw it out, you see what comes in, instead of going through all these processes that ends up giving it to the ex-general. So I would like to see competitive bidding for all of these processes and all of this new equipment. What do you need all this new equipment? I think you ought to bring in McKinsey and have them do a service to their nation and run the State Department, I mean the Defense Department. One thing struck me, that the contracting out of the Defense Department is more than about 10 agencies combined. I mean, it's huge. And, you know, I want to ask Mr. Rutherford, and you had slightly different numbers than what the Defense Business Board came out with on what the final numbers were. Is that true?
Yes, ma'am.
Why was that, do you think?
So they finished the report in January 2015. We spent then 3-4 months longer with the DCMO going deeper into the sub-functions. So we had the luxury of actually looking at some of the lower level data. We actually then brought in different types of benchmarks that we used and how you can actually achieve productivity gains. And that came up with a number that both in terms of the amount of spend came down, but it had more to do with the timing, how much you can achieve over a 5-year period.
And your contract spend optimization, do you think that that would have potential savings, and how much, and what is contract spend optimization? What is that?
So contract spend optimization is when you look at the contracts every year as they come up. Are you actually, for rebidding purpose or renegotiation purposes, actually looking at, one, what does the Department of Defense really need from a requirement standpoint? And then two, from a bottom-up standpoint, what should it cost the Department of Defense with more of a bottom-up view? And then you get a sense of where your negotiation power is to actually do optimization of those contracts over time. So every year you're getting better and better at the contracting process.
Well, see, but I don't understand. We have the greatest military in the world, but they can't seem to manage anything. We're the best and the strongest. And how much savings did you attribute to aggregating and renegotiating contracts?
So for the aggregate, I'll have to go back and look at the numbers, but what we looked at for there on the contract spend, that was going to be from a year-over-year savings. We were looking at $4 to $5 billion every year for our $62 billion. Of that, it was going to be about 20% to 25% of that number would be in the contract optimization.
Well, these are the huge savings. I have one report that they gave me, but it's from the business group. Could I see the original report that McKinsey did? you know?
I believe all those, all of our deliverables that we gave to the DCMO were provided, but I can go back and check to make sure that that happened.
But I mean, you know, I didn't, could I see your report? I'd like to see, this is the report that we have. Was that yours?
So there's the DBB report that they did, which was published on January 15th. Our contract went beyond that, and it was our contract had a number of deliverables that were inputs into that report. But what we provided for the DCMO was a set of contract deliverables that looked not only at what the baseline was, but what metrics did they use for productivity gains, and then what was the estimated savings in each of those categories.
I'm sorry, we've got votes going on the floor now, so I want to thank all the witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. You've been very patient. You've been here a very long time. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit questions for the record. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.